Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar presentation, CMMC Explained for Small Business Owners and CFOs. I'm Don Carnevale, Marketing Director at NeoSystems, and I'll be your host for today's event. Now I'd like to hand off to your moderator, Stuart Itkin, Senior Vice President at NeoSystems. Stuart?
Well, Don, thank you. Now, there's been an ongoing stream of events and webinars over the past several months, intended for IT professionals, for cyber security professionals, and compliance and policy wonks. And they've often taken deep dives into specific technical controls. They've traced the origin of various regulations back to like the times of the Department of Defense's 1983 Orange Book. And with few exceptions, all have been a mumble jumble of acronyms and jargon. And while most have included valuable information, what was said was often undecipherable or just not meaningful to a small business owner or financial executive. So today's discussion is going to be different. So you're now entering an acronym-free zone, or at least any acronym that we use will be defined before it is used. So we're going to try to avoid compliance, geek speak, or techno babble throughout the conversation. Today's discussion is intended for small business owners and for finance executives to help you understand the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, or CMMC, our first acronym, and what it means to your business and what you're required to do. The CMMC program does not come without potential business risks or exposure, and we'll talk about potential risks and liabilities as well as explain how you can mitigate those risks and liabilities. So my name is Stuart Itkin. I'm Senior Vice President with NeoSystems. At NeoSystems, we're experts who live and breathe compliance and regulatory standards so our clients don't need to. We're a managed service provider, or MSP, that offers comprehensive solutions for CMMC that provide an accelerated, affordable, low-risk path to certification readiness. I've been involved in supply chain risk management and cybersecurity compliance for over a decade. Prior to NeoSystems, I was head of products for ExoStar, a Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce Form joint venture, and VP of CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance at Coal-Fire Federal. So let me ask our two other speakers to introduce themselves, starting with Marcy Womack.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Stuart. I'm Marcy Womack. I am a managing director here at Schellman. So Schellman is a cybersecurity assessment firm. In this context, we're a C3 PAO. So Tim and I are both certified assessors and help lead our practice as CMMC kind of ramps up and as NIST 800-171 has been in place for some time. So as mentioned, I oversee all things kind of federal assessment. So FedRAMP, state ramp, anything that can be based on NIST 853 or 171, those types of standards, and look forward to speaking with you all today.
And Tim?
Hi, Tim. Thanks, Stuart. Tim Walsh, a Federal Practice Manager with Schellman. As Marcy said, with that same overview, but really primarily overseeing engagements where organizations may be seeking for that third party to come assess their environments or enclaves. As it pertains to CMMC, this may be because of current contractual obligations, or those who may be interested in responding to a DoD solicitation in the future. In addition, overseeing assessments of cloud service providers under FedRAMP who may be looking to market their services to federal agencies and understanding how that impacts organizations who may be then leveraging those cloud service offerings under CMMC, which we'll touch upon here in a bit.
Well, great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Marcy. I think in starting out, it's important to understand why the CMMC program is being put into place and frankly, why it's important. It's curious. We're under a constant barrage of cyber attacks from foreign adversaries, but we don't seem to be alarmed. And companies within the supply chain to the Department of Defense, which we refer to as the Defense Industrial Base, or the DIB, well, they're the primary targets of many of these attacks. It's difficult for people to appreciate something that they can't see, feel, touch, or hold in their hand, like a cyber attack. But when a Chinese weather balloon traversed the country about a year ago, the concern and attention it drew was off the charts. You couldn't tune into the news without hearing about it. Well, the cyber threat is just as real, and the stakes are even higher. Russia's focused on accessing and compromising our critical infrastructure and in sowing misinformation through a variety of tactics. In China, Well, China just wants to track everything and everybody. And if you remember the OPM breach, courtesy of the Chinese, and the Chinese are also very interested and unfortunately really good at stealing our intellectual property. And the cyber attacks that have been waged have been very effective. Theft of intellectual property by the Chinese government enabled them to design and produce the J-31, which is a replica of the F-35 strike fighter. And they did that 2 years after the F-35 was introduced. Well, the F-35 took the US government a decade to develop at a cost of almost $1 trillion and was supposed to ensure ours and our allies' air superiority. And when our adversaries, know how our weapon systems work, they know how to combat them. In 2018, the Washington Post reported that the Chinese state actors had stolen 614 gigabytes of information from a Navy defense contractor. The data included detailed information on Sea Dragon, which was a ship-to-ship hypersonic missile system, as well as other information about our codes and our cryptography. So imagine the consequences if we hadn't uncovered the Sea Dragon incident. And the Chinese not only knew how Sea Dragon worked, but had their own and knew how to compromise ours. So it's not as if the state or the Department of Defense hasn't tried to stem the theft of intellectual properties. It has, but the mechanisms put in place have proven ineffective. In 1917, the Department of Defense required companies within the defense industrial base that stored, processed, or transmitted sensitive defensive information, referred to as controlled unclassified information, or CUI, to satisfy the requirements of the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, or NIST's Special Publication 800-171, which is entitled Protecting Controlled Unclassified Information in Non-Federal Systems and Organizations. And presumably that's what the majority of people here today are. They are non-federal organizations operating non-federal systems. And Marcy and Tim will talk more about those requirements a little bit later. The Department of Defense required companies to assess their own compliance with those regulations and to attest to their compliance to the DoD. What happened? Organizations didn't give the requirements the attention they deserved, and in many cases, they didn't understand the requirements and what they needed to do to satisfy them, and felt what they were doing was often good enough. Others simply gave themselves the benefit of the doubt when grading their own test. And finally, there were those who knowingly misrepresented their results or just said they passed without even taking the test. Why not? Nobody was checking up on them. Expecting people to know what to do and to do the right thing just simply didn't work. So this is why the CMMC program was created. CMMC it's not a compliance framework. It's not a new set of requirements. The requirements again existed since 1917, or that should be 2017, or about 6 years, 4 months, and 1 day ago. CMMC was created as a mechanism to enforce conformance with the existing regulations to ensure that anyone receiving, storing, or transmitting controlled unclassified information has satisfied all of the requirements in NIST SP 800-171, and that they are capable of protecting the sensitive information they are entrusted with, whether they receive that information from the DoD, a third party, or if they create it themselves. So, while the focus has been on controlled unclassified information, the CMMC program actually addresses two types of information: federal contract information, commonly referred to as FCI, and controlled unclassified information, or CUI. Your obligations under CMMC are different for each type of information. So federal contract information pertains to data not publicly available that a contractor, subcontractor, or a supplier obtains on behalf of a U.S. federal agency. It is information that is not marked as public or for public release and is subject to minimum cybersecurity requirements. So if you receive information and it doesn't say public or for public release, assume that it is at a minimum federal contract information. Controlled unclassified information, on the other hand, is information the government creates or possesses, or that a contractor or subcontractor creates or on behalf of the government, that needs to be protected according to a law, a regulation, or a government-wide policy. And your responsibility is to identify CUI within your organization and for handling it in accordance with the applicable laws and regulations that apply to that CUI. Now, not all CUI is created equal, and understanding CUI can be complicated. And we're really not going to take a deep dive into that. That could be its own probably series of webinars. So let me ask, Marcy, what does an organization need to do with the information that it has?
Excellent. So we get this question a lot. It's, as a C3PAO, as leaders in the space, it's organizations come to us wanting to know, hey, we know CMMC is coming. Where do we start? What do we do? What are the assessment requirements? What can we do internally as an organization? All those things. And really first, we want to understand what levels of CMMC that organization may need to adhere to. So really there are 3 levels within CMMC. We're focusing on 2 here because it's expected that those are going to be the most prevalent and the most kind of focused on. So level 1 is for organizations that are only handling that federal contract information, or FCI, as Stuart just talked about. So, and you'll see, in parallel here, there are differences between level 1 and level 2, where level 2, in addition to focusing on FCI, it encompasses that controlled unclassified information, CUI. And then, of course, there are controls that are applicable, as well as all the assessment objectives that are required to be reviewed during the assessment, and other stipulations are kind of noted here. So just starting with level 1, it's 17 controls. These are considered like basic controls that most organizations will have in place or should have in place for their organization and for the data that they're handling. There are assessment objectives that tie into those controls. So when we look at controls, those are defined in kind of the parent document, NIST 800-171. And the assessment objectives are defined in NIST 800-171A. And so you'll be able to see, we call the assessment objectives kind of the key to the test, because when assessors come in, or if you're executing a self-assessment, those are the objectives and the procedures that you're expected to follow. So it's, the parent control could be something as simple as, ensure multi-factor is in place for network access for privileged accounts. But the assessment objectives are going to break those down into kind of like a step-by-step process of, hey, this is a pretty simple statement, but let's see what this looks like in more depth. So as you can see, 17 controls, 59 assessment objectives. There's the annual self-assessment requirement. So third-party, notably, third-party assessment is not required for level 1. So that's one of the big kind of differences and key takeaways, I think, that are really important for small businesses to understand. And then, there's also a senior official affirmation to essentially sign off on that self-assessment, stating that those 17 controls are in place as demonstrated by kind of a met status of those 59 assessment objectives. And then similarly, on the level 2 side, moving over, you can see it expands. There's more information that's included in the scope of that assessment. So we're looking at a broader set of controls. It's 110 controls. This has complete parity with NIST 800-171. So as Stuart mentioned, CMMC is not a new certification, or it's not a new standard. It's taking an existing standard, putting a certification framework around it. And then you'll also see the assessment objectives go up, of course, because there are additional objectives for the new controls. And then the big key difference here is there is a third-party assessment requirement by a C3PAO or certified third-party assessment organization like Schellman or any other C3PAO. They're required to come in every 3 years and perform a CMMC certification assessment. In those off years, so in years 2 and 3, there's an annual self-assessment required, as well as a sign-off by a senior official at the organization. Back to you, Stuart.
Great, I'll take it from here. Yeah, thanks, Marcy. And now to take a step back as to what is in place today and looking towards the future with CMMC. As previously mentioned, there are contractual requirements for the information systems of any non-federal entities. So this could be contractors, vendors, suppliers that, process, store, transmit, or protects that federal contract information or controlled unclassified information for the Department of Defense. Now, all DoD contracts that may involve that FCI or CUI today, contain clauses and verbiage that mandate that cybersecurity compliance. And there are 4 main regulations to be familiar with at a high level, such as the Federal Acquisition Regulation, also known as FAR, under 52204 for that FCI, and Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, also known as DFARS. There's a few under which 7012, 7019, 7020 for CUI. Now, while the FAR has a smaller number of security controls for basic cyber hygiene, DFARS 7012 does take that a step further and largely outlines, that you must safeguard CUI in compliance with NIST 800-171 in that standard, but, contains other stipulations as well. Whereas, DFARS, 7019 dictates the use of what's referred to as the Supplier Performance Risk System, also known as SPRS. And we'll talk about this more below. And then DFARS 7020, which is at a high level, is really which contractors, they may be subject to provide the government access to their environment to conduct a medium or high assessment. In addition to, subcontractors, vendors, and suppliers that may not contract directly with DoD, but are often still required by those prime contractors to meet the compliance requirements. This is because what they require and call flow down of the compliance mandates from the prime contractor to these other participants. Now, once the environment's posture in regard to NIST 800-171 is determined, the aforementioned SPRS system contains, a questionnaire of sorts with the controls from 800-171, asking for the implementation status of those controls. Each control has a number value associated with it, and that score adds up to a maximum of 110. Now, the score is, back to what Stuart was saying in terms of, what is meant to be, depicted within that score. Now, each control has, is not meant to add up to be an aspiration, right, in terms of what you plan to do, but more so to help report on your gaps may be. Now, there may be an indicated control as planned, and that's okay, but that doesn't mean you necessarily give credit for that at any given time. Now, the most important with that reporting is what they call a system security plan, also referred to as an SSP. And you actually report on that as part of SPRS, but you ultimately want to make sure all of your implementation statements in regards to the 800-171 standard is meeting in compliance with what's outlined in your SSP, essentially making sure your implementation within the SSP matches what's being inputted into SPRS. Now, as it pertains to CMMC, looking towards the future and the process of assessments, and this is really, primarily focusing on what and Marcy had mentioned under level 2, is that, certification assessments and, cannot occur until rulemaking is complete. Now, there are a couple other larger milestones that stand in that way leading up to the finalization, namely another review with the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, also referred to as OIRA, as all executive branch regulations must be reviewed by them as part of the rulemaking process. So OIRA reviewed and the rule associated with the CMMC program as part of its proposed rule and prior to its release back in December. And will need to do so again. So once those comments are adjudicated from the review, it would eventually go into their hands once again. So in addition, it will eventually require a congressional review. And given that's an election year, we're estimating the finalization of that rule to occur sometime in Q1 of 2025. Of course, that doesn't mean that you're subject to CMMC right away. And CMMC itself will take time to go into effect and also be written in DoD contracts, but just gives the opportunity at that point for CMMC certifications to occur where applicable. Now, you may be asking what governs the structure and workflow of these certification assessments. That's where the CMMC assessment process, also referred to as the CAP, comes into play. The CAP comes with 4 different phases and describes the required activities to ensure that CMMC assessments are conducted consistently. So the CAP is currently in a draft state, so I want to preface that, and is expected to change. But as it stands today, there are 4 phases at a high level, one being that you're planning and preparing for the assessment. So really, consistent communication with your certified third-party organization, such as us, Schellman here in this context, and in an organization seeking certification, also referred to as an OSC, making sure that that communication is, effective, and being able to determine an OSC's readiness and ability to provide the required information that would go into an assessment. That includes the integrity and accuracy of the scope that would be assessed. Moving into the phase 2 of the actual conduct of the assessment is really to assess those, CMMC practices. So what Marcia was referring to, whether it's, level 1, level 2, and level 3, making sure that, the conformance at the CMMC level that the organization is seeking, the assessment team would come and verify the adequacy and the sufficiency of that evidence and determine whether practices have been met and ultimately report on those gaps. Phase 3, looking more at the reporting of the assessment results. And really, this is, the final assessment results from phase 2, where the lead assessor would deliver those recommended results to the OSC during the final findings briefing. And then following that, there are some quality assurance checks that go through to make sure everything is comprehensive and accurate. And ultimately getting to the last phase, phase 4, which is the closeout of POAMs as part of the assessment. Now, the purpose of phase 4 is to allow those OSCs to meet a path of that may be eligible for remediation, because there are some stipulations that say certain practices may or may not be eligible for that, to close out those practices and validate those as a part of a POAM, plan of action and milestone, during the 3-POW assessment in order to obtain ultimately a passing score. So at this time, I'll hand it back over to Stuart for the next set of topics.
Very good. Thank you, Tim. So again, a lot that we can go into from a detail standpoint, but hopefully that provides a good overview of kind of what the CMMC framework is, what the program is, the framework underlying it, and kind of the assessment process that you'll be required to follow, whether it's one of self-assessment or whether it's an assessment by a certified third-party assessment organization. And I mentioned at the beginning is that this is a program that does not come without risk or liability. And one source of liability emanates from the requirement that an organization attest its compliance with the applicable requirements and that a senior official personally affirm to what has been submitted. And what this creates is opportunity for corporate liability and personal liability for the one who affirmed the results and so forth. And under the False Claims Act, the Department of Defense is wrapping up investigations of alleged items to be able to identify kind of people who have misrepresented either intentionally or unintentionally. And again, it's important to understand how the DoD is using this, because I imagine that most of us don't look good in orange jumpsuits. So if we look at the False Claims Act, it says that the False Claim Act provides that any person who knowingly submits or causes to submit false claims to the government is liable for to the government for 3 times the government's damages. And this isn't something that has been taken lightly. There's been some recent cases in the news. Penn State was charged by the Department of Defense under the False Claims Act in September of 2023. Georgia Tech also in 2023 and agreed to settle for allegations of violating the False Claims Act, paying $90,000. Boeing in 2023 to settle allegations under the False Claims Act paid a penalty of $8.1 million. And in 2022, Aerojet Rocketdyne paid $9 million to resolve false claims allegation. And overall, the government collected over $2 billion in 2022 as a result of False Claim Act's settlements. And again, it's not just the big names that the government has been pursuing. It's looking at the False Claims Act as kind of another tool to really enforce compliance with the requirements, as I said, that have been in existence since 2017. Well, there's another law to be aware of, and it's called the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. And this was launched in October of 2021 by the Department of Justice. And the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative was launched to identify, pursue, and prosecute cybersecurity-related fraud against the government. It uses the False Claim Act to hold government contractors accountable for cybersecurity and prioritizes enforcement against companies and individuals that knowingly violate cybersecurity requirements. Interestingly, a whistleblower provision is included that allows individuals to file suits on behalf of the government, and whistleblowers can be awarded between 15 and 30% of damages that exist. And if we were to go back to the Rocketdyne Aerojet case, again, $9 million settlement. The whistleblower in that case was a gentleman named Brian Marcus. Well, Brian Marcus got a check from the federal government for $2.61 million. So not only is the government looking and trying to identify those that have misrepresented their state of compliance with the requirements for CMMC, but there is also the motivation for others within an organization who recognize an organization has just misrepresented its results to be able to file a suit on behalf of the government directly. So additional risks and liabilities relate to the to the risk of just non-compliance, and non-compliance, not having completed successfully the certification that's required, affects award eligibility. If we look at the schedule that Tim talked about, the second phase of the rollout of CMMC, which could occur as early as the fall of 2025, requires an organization to have completed a conditional assessment, a C3PAO assessment, with items that can be resolved within a period of 6 months, but they need a minimum score to be award eligible as of phase 2. And as of phase 3, which could be as early as the spring of 2026, the requirement is that an organization must have successfully completed an assessment and become certified with a score of 110, meaning no exceptions. Every one of those controls has had to have been demonstrated to be satisfied. If you fail to have that certification, you're just no longer eligible for a contract. If you have received a contract with a conditional certification, you're liable for the loss of that contract or termination in the event you don't close out those exception items, the plan of action and milestone items within a period of 6 months. Other potential liability under this is a risk of reputational loss. Certainly we think of Aerodyne Rocketjet, and its names in the news continues to just kind of echo with people, and an organization that has certainly failed to meet these requirements and who subsequently achieves or experiences a breach, again, has additional liability as a consequence of that. So both in terms of the the attestations that are made and the affirmations, as well as just non-compliance, probably represent two of the biggest risk areas that organizations need to be aware of under the CMMC program. So Marcy, how is it that organizations could think about mitigate the risk and liability that exists?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I would say, and this is not on the slide, but identify any FCI or CUI that you might have. Take a look at the data that you're being handled or given in the performance of a contract, or the data that you're creating as you're performing that contract, because that's going to drive so much of the controls that the organization's required to implement the certification or self-assessment requirements, is really understanding the types of data, the systems that that data is flowing to. So not only data identification, but data flow is really important. If you come to us for an assessment and say, we need this, and we're going to say, awesome, let's talk about it. Like, what systems are in scope? If you say, I don't know, that's a tougher conversation to have, right? So understanding what data you have, what systems are touching that data, which systems are performing security protection, assets or handling that types of data are also important. And so don't wait. If you've waited till now, that is what it is, but try not to wait any longer. Start having those conversations, start reviewing your data flows, start reviewing the requirements. Look at those level 1, those 17 controls in scope for level 1, those 110 controls in scope for level 2. Understand what you might be looking at. And I would also encourage you, I know I mentioned this briefly previously, but not just to look at NIST 800-171A or look at the CMMC standard, but to look at let me rephrase, not just to look at 171, but also look at 171A, because those assessment objectives are what your assessors are going to be asking you or what you're going to be asking yourself during a self-assessment. And they are much more granular in detail compared to the overarching kind of like baseline control. So continue to take all those efforts now. That way you can start identifying areas that you feel really confident in, areas that might need some improvement. And then you can identify the actions to kind of get to that next step. It's coming. So I know Tim just briefly went through kind of that CMMC finalization timeline. It's anticipated to be Q1 of 25, and then there will be kind of a rollout period from there and kind of an enforcement schedule. And that's detailed in the CMMC rule as well, if you haven't read that. In terms of how you can work with third parties or how you can do things internally, we always recommend that folks start with a gap assessment. It's a great bang for buck because, if we're really looking at kind of control design. So if you're not approaching a control in the right way, it doesn't really matter if you've implemented it in the way that you said, if the way that you're looking at it is not quite right. And so that way, you're getting this high level overview of, is your scoping make sense? Do you have your SSP documented well? Are you thinking about controls in the right way respective to the scope? And it would allow you to understand where your weaknesses are, where you might be more solid from a third party's perspective. So to have more confidence going into a future assessment. There are many different assessment types that can be performed, and everyone uses slightly different terminology. So, gap assessment, or maybe a mock assessment or a compliance assessment, various different strategies to go about having those performed. And it's really more about the outcome that you're looking for. So one of the big risk mitigations that our clients consistently come to us and say, hey, we have a 171 requirement right now, and we want to do more than a self-assessment. We want a third party, we want a C3 PAO to perform a detailed compliance assessment. So we have a report that we can show our customers who we're contractually bound with to demonstrate that we're meeting NIST 800-171. And so that's excellent. And that helps mitigate some of that risk because you're not just relying on an internal self-assessment. There's more weight to it. It also gives you a really good insight into what to expect during potentially a future CMMC assessment, and understand and prepare your teams and your processes, and just really get audit and assessment ready. So that's always something to consider as well. And then the last bullet here is really about joint surveillance. So you may or may not be familiar with this term. Joint surveillance came to be in around August of 22. And this is what I lovingly call like a pseudo CMMC assessment. And what it really is, it's a DIBCAC high assessment. So DIBCAC is kind of the assessment arm of the Defense Contract Management Agency. They're the ones who are doing like looking at SPURS scores. They're the ones who are performing those assessments of contractors against 171. And that's happening right now. So some of those DFARS clauses that Tim mentioned previously, they kind of tie in with the DIBCAC arm and exactly the assessments that they're out there performing. But in a joint surveillance assessment, it's against NIST 800-171. The C3 PAO comes in jointly with the the DIPCAC team, and they're performing that assessment of the organization. And there are certain stipulations that have to be met, like perfect score within 180 days. You have to have, in order to be eligible for joint surveillance, you have to have an active contract, have to have a SPURS score, those types of things. But the outcome of joint surveillance is you have a DIPCAC high assessment and score performed and completed, which is awesome. And then that could potentially convert to a level 2 certification as well once CMMC rulemaking is complete. So there are a number of different factors in that, but we've gotten a lot of questions. Folks kind of hear that term being tossed around. Obviously, potential risk mitigation strategy, because it's even a higher level of assessment, compared to a gap assessment or anything like that.
Marcy, let me ask you a question, because you mentioned the value of having a C3PAO's assessment in making yourself look more attractive to a potential prime, showing that you represent lower risk. But if we look back at the liability that exists with respect to affirmation, and this exists at level 1, not just at level 2, should an organization, before it kind of puts its name on the line, before that senior official signs, is there a benefit in having a C3PAO come in and validate kind of their self-assessment as some means of mitigating that risk from an affirmation?
Yeah, that is certainly possible. And really, it's one of those balances of let's understand the self-assessment process the organization's gone through, the rigor there. And if we see any concerns or red flags, or if there are areas of improvement, just to suggest. And then of course, if we were to perform that assessment, would be all the more rigorous, just because it would be our assessment procedures as certified assessors and as a C3PAO. But any of those activities help mitigate risk, because you're having other certified and accredited personnel and specialists really looking at this and ensuring that there are no gaping holes, so to speak.
Right. And let me talk a little bit more about mitigating non-compliance risk. As we described, the requirements that you're subject to, they're very specific. They're exacting in the assessment process. That Tim described to verify conformance is pretty rigorous. And rather than trying to understand the requirements yourself and attempting to put in place the information technology, the information security, the physical security policies and procedures that are needed, one option is to leverage qualified, and I emphasize the word qualified, experts who really understand the requirements and who have successfully helped others address them. And again, it's not just about achieving compliance. Compliance isn't a destination. Getting that certification, isn't kind of the end. It's an ongoing process, and you need to be able to maintain compliance, not just achieve compliance. So some external service providers that you may consider working with, again, who fit that requirement of knowing and understanding the requirements and having demonstrated the ability to satisfy them, include managed service providers. Those are third-party companies that provide IT services and solutions, ongoing support and management of your technology, your networks. They operate your help desk, they perform system maintenance and patching and so forth, and manage security service providers that are, again, third parties that provide network security services, incident response, and so forth. And so, being able to leverage resources that are qualified, that again, understand and have really devoted themselves to, understanding the requirements and what needs to be done to ensure that you're satisfying them as you achieve compliance, and that you continue to satisfy them on an ongoing basis to maintain compliance is important. Second, rather than trying to do it, all in-house as kind of a do-it-yourself project, one thing to do is to consider moving to a validated kind of purpose-built solution that has been demonstrated to satisfy requirements. And I know when I take on kind of a do-it-yourself project at home, I kind of, end up with the 3 trips to Home Depot. The first one to get the things that I think I need. The second trip, to be able to go get the things that I didn't know that I needed until I started the project. And the third one is to replace the things that I broke when I got frustrated trying to, to put it together. And, rather than kind of making this a do-it-yourself project, consider looking at solutions that have been pre-built and migrating to a solution that has been validated to already satisfy the technical requirements and the non-technical requirements. That solution can include information technology. It can include policies and procedures, as well. And finally, if you select a pre-built solution, whether again it's IT or policies and procedures, minimize customization. Customization creates an opportunity to take something that meets requirements and turn it into something that doesn't, potentially breaking something. So one final point here is while you can leverage external service providers and you can take advantage of pre-built solutions, you can outsource the responsibility. You can outsource, for example, patching of your systems to a managed service provider, but you can't outsource accountability. You are still liable. You still remain accountable for ensuring that the things that the external service providers you use, that the solutions that you've bought, in fact, that they have done, that they are operating properly, that they satisfy those requirements. So if you're using a managed service provider, you outsource the responsibility for patching, you're still accountable that patching has occurred and that it's been done properly. And so choosing the wrong partners can also create risk for you. It can cause risk of false claims. It can create a risk of non-compliance. So it's very important that you carefully choose the external service partners that you work with. So one last thing to share before we get into to some of the questions, we're trying to answer some of the questions, is that we do have something that we will be sending out to everyone who's attended the webinar and a follow-up email. As we said, we wanted to try to avoid the the techno babble and the geek speak, and to avoid all of the alphabet soup. But we've provided or created an ebook that we'll send you that kind of includes every possible acronym. I think every possible acronym you can possibly need to decode things that you read related to CMMC and related to its related requirements, as well as providing some recipes that you can follow to ensure your success in being able to satisfy the requirements and being able to successfully go through the certification assessment. So with that, Don, let me open this up to questions.
Thank you, Stuart. We have received a number of questions, so we're just going to go through those one at a time. Stuart, the first one I think is for you. You mentioned that there were different types of controlled unclassified information, and this guest would like to know why they need to know the type and how that affects them.
Wow. Okay. Well, and Marcy may want to chime in here as well. I think that there are a variety of forms of controlled unclassified information. They generally fall into 2 categories: CUI basic and CUI specified. And CUI specified means exactly that. There are a specific set of requirements or regulations that are required for an organization to follow to see that that data is handled according to the law regulations. So I think a lot of people have heard of ITAR, or the International Traffic in Arms Regulations requirements. And ITAR is a particular category of CUI, and ITAR has some very specific requirements that need to be followed. One is data residency. CUI that is ITAR data needs to be resident only in the United States. It can only be accessed and supported by U.S. persons and so forth. And that list of requirements goes on. And again, you're responsible for ensuring that you understand the types of CUI that you have, that if it's CUI specified for that type of CUI, understanding what are the specific requirements, the specific regulations that you need to follow and for following them. And so, stating that you've satisfied the requirements for the type of CUI you have when you may not have. And for example, if you have ITAR but haven't met the data sovereignty requirements for ITAR data, but have claimed you have, two things can happen. One is you're not going to pass your conformance audit. You're not going to receive certification, and so you won't be contract eligible. But secondarily, if you've claimed that you are, you're potentially liable under the False Claims Act. So kind of understanding the types of CUI you have, understanding what specific requirements each one may have with it, and following those requirements is really important. I know, Marcy or Tim, anything you'd want to add to that?
I don't have anything. I thought you described that really well and kind of differentiating some of those different areas. Yeah.
So Marcy and Tim, I think this next question is for you. Even if I don't have to do a third-party assessment now before CMMC is final, are there advantages to doing that anyways?
Yeah, I can take this one, Marcy. So I think certainly, understanding, where you would stack up against a third-party audit prior to it being, required, let's say, as a part of a contractual obligation is certainly a lot of value into that. The only reason is because, if you look at some of the phases we outlined earlier as part of the assessment process, there are going to be situations at which you have a remediation or POAM period, at which some of those controls, at least outlined in that, CMMC assessment process, if it's a higher value, when we were talking about that SPURS score, and it is something that they deem, maybe quote unquote a critical control, there may be something, if there is a deficiency associated with that practice, that wouldn't be eligible for remediation. So having that assessment with the 3POW prior to that point, and understanding if maybe there is a larger deficiency to work out to remediate and make sure that you would be better prepared for that certification assessment is certainly a lot of value there. Anything else there, Marcy?
Nope, nailed it.
Great. Next question is, Stuart, maybe for you. You emphasize the importance of selecting a good service provider. How do you know whether someone is good or not?
Oh, wow. I think the biggest thing that you can do is to ask questions and ask the right questions and make sure you get the right answers to them. If you ask the question, to a potential provider, do you know what NIST 800-171 is? And they kind of give you a blank stare, run, don't walk. If you ask them if they themselves have satisfied the requirements of NIST 800-171, which will become a requirement for managed service providers, and they say no, it's kind of cause for to concern. Questions, like, well, have you worked with other, or have you any organizations that have gone through a joint surveillance assessment or a DIBCAC assessment? And the important question is, say, and passed, that you support. The answer is yes. That's a pretty good indication then that they are a qualified organization. Challenges, that we've seen companies out there making claims that are just, absolutely incredible. We saw one when we were at a conference last fall out in San Diego, where somebody was saying that they could get you compliant for 800-171, 853, which is bigger than 800-171, with the NIST cybersecurity framework, a bunch of other things, in 2 weeks or less. And of course, they did it with artificial intelligence. And again, we just know that that's not a credible claim. But the challenge is that the organizations that need these service providers need them because they themselves may not be really able to just kind of tell the difference between the news from the noise of why we're better, why we do something. So again, asking the right questions is important to verify that somebody is qualified. Do you have qualified or certified assessors on your staff who've completed the CMMC training, have taken the test and received that accreditation and so forth. And there's a couple of places that you can go to find some good examples of these questions. The NDISAC, with the help of Allison Giddens, has put together a document on how to screen potential service providers. I think Leah Shillabad, who speaks often on topics related to CMMC, has produced a guide for organizations, kind of the questions to ask in looking to be able to select an external service provider. But kind of the net is, you just need to ask, the right questions and make sure that somebody really has the knowledge and the capability. And if they've done it before successfully for someone else, I think that's a pretty good sign that you can feel comfortable.
Thanks, Stuart. This is another one, I think, from Marcy and Tim. Are there certification or assessment requirements for external service providers that I need to be mindful of when looking for an ESP?
I'll take this one, and Tim, jump in at any point. Yes, so we saw this really become more formalized within the proposed rule that was released in December. So, external service providers, as Stuart kind of outlined in his chart, can encompass, managed service providers, cloud service providers, managed security service providers. But really, to put it simply, if you are passing on CUI or any of your specific data to an external service provider for a cloud, that cloud provider would need to be FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP equivalent, as recently defined by DoD. So that's kind of the standard they're required to follow there to handle that type of data. And then from an MSP, MSSP side, they are required to follow NIST 800-171 and CMMC for when they're handling that data. So there's some nuance with the MSP discussion in terms of if they're not really, if they don't maintain any ownership of that data, and they're kind of coming to the organization systems and performing all of their work and their services on the organization systems, then that MSP probably doesn't need to be CMMC or NIST 800-171. They would probably be involved in the organization's assessment because they're performing a lot of those perhaps control specific activities. But that's kind of the breakdown there. Tim, anything you want to add, or Stuart?
No, that was great. Thanks, Marcy.
Cool.
Okay, so we do have a few more questions. Let's go to the next one. Can a third-party IT company complete a company's self-assessment with senior management approval, or is a self-assessment only done by an employee of a company valid?
I can take a stab at this one because I pulled up the draft rule just to see if it said anything definitive. And so this is not like a direct answer. It says the OSA, so the organization seeking assessment, must perform the self-assessment. So it's unclear whether like a third party performing that or a contractor would be able to assist. But that is what kind of the proposed rule states.
I guess I just, from a matter of practice, at least one case where an organization going through doing its self-assessment, had a third party kind of ride along with them to kind of look over their shoulders to help ensure that they were doing it properly.
Okay, I think we'll take one more. And for those of you who have asked questions that we're not able to get to, we will answer those after the webinar, and we'll get back to you with those responses. So please keep an eye out for that. This next question here is, whoops, lost my place. I apologize. For CMMC level 2, is there any information about when or how a company's self-assessment will suffice versus needing an assessment by a third party?
My understanding is that is going to be up to, I believe, the contracting officer or at the responsibility of who is writing that RFP or getting to those terms. Stuart, I don't know if you have any additional context there in your experience.
Yeah, the only, well, first of all, I guess what DOD has stated, and I think this was in the proposed rule, is that the number of companies or the percentage of all companies that require level 2, it's a very, very small percentage that will be allowed to self-assess, that will not require the C3PAO certification. I think the other side I heard was that anybody who is dealing with munitions, anybody who's dealing with a weapons platform, something that goes on the ground and the sea, on the air, or goes boom, they will likely, without a doubt, be required to have a third-party assessment. But I don't think there has been any specific guidance. I'm sure there'll be some guidance provided to the contracting officers, but again, the expectation created by the Department of Defense is that it is going to be an exception for an organization with CUI to not have to go through a third-party assessment.
All right, I think we've got one more that we're going to try to fit in here. For vendors who have the FCI FAR clause within their contract, what is their obligation currently without the final rule? Do they need to create an SSP and a POAM and upload a score into the SPURS system?
Yeah, so I can speak to this a little bit. I think that, when you go into, the basic cyber hygiene for that, right, under FCI, and you're looking at, what you need to address, that there isn't necessarily a control per se that is tied to something like a system security plan. But I think, as a part of your, communication with your primes, they may ask for something like an SSP as a part of your self-assessment for that, FCI and what you're really being held to. No matter what type of data you process, it's likely that somebody would request what would be a pseudo SSP at the very least to understand how you're meeting some of those requirements.
Okay, so I think that's going to wrap it up. Again, there's several other questions that we do not have time for, but we will answer those and get back to those of you who